Hello everyone and welcome to the next video. It's been a while since I recorded a vlog out in the woods. Feels very familiar. I think it's been about 8 months or so since I last recorded a video out in nature. So I'm returning with this explication or description of my book idea. An idea that I've been cultivating for some time now. Towards that place, thresholds, portals, and ecocentric horizons. That's the current title, at least. Now, I'll just start off by saying that I had hoped to be a little bit more confident in the contents of this book. Indeed, I'd say about 2 weeks ago or so, I was sure that this was the direction the book was going to take in terms of the structure and the detail of the book. However, that's been wavering. My confidence has been wavering a little bit, so I thought I would just come out here in the woods as the weather is starting to get a little bit better and record this video detailing my thoughts on the book. So this will be non-fiction, as you'll probably be able to guess just by the title. This is a book that I hope will bring together all of my experiences and thoughts under the banner of thresholds and portals, this motif that I've been perpetually fascinated by. Now, before I go into the book itself, I just want to clarify that I feel like I should have done this or started this quite a long time ago. However, I suppose that one could make the argument that I've now got more experience. I needed that life experience, getting out and outdoors and studying ecology and countryside management, and of course doing the MA Res in literature was a way of gaining more discipline. And I suppose now I've got more connections as well with the ecological citizen and so forth. But again, still, I feel like I should be chapters into this by now. The proposal should almost be done, I feel like, by now, at this stage in my life. However, there's hopefully still plenty of years to come, still plenty of years ahead of me to work on this project, because I feel like towards that place is my main life goal. And that's tricky because I tend to, if I want to make something my life goal, I tend to fret about it a lot and worry that it will never come to fruition. But I'm hoping with all of the work that I have done in the past, all the experiences that I've gained out in nature and with research and so forth, I will be able to make this come alive. So there's a lot to get into here, of course. However, I'm going to try and give a bit less detail for a few reasons. One of which is although I'm drawing on well-established areas, I do also want to try and keep my ideas and the way that I'm structuring the book and the way that I'm framing certain topics kind of unique and original to me, I suppose. So I'm going to be giving a bit less detail to ensure that stays that way. So where I am currently with this book is that I have a chapter outline, which I've printed off for the purposes of this video, and I'm working my way slowly through the proposal. Of course, for those that don't know, a non-fiction book is primarily sold on the proposal. And I'm talking here about traditional publishing. I have various concerns about self-publishing, which I probably won't get into in this video, but I would hope that with my background in skills and experience, I would hope that I would be able to traditionally publish this book at some point in the future. And so what I'm doing is I'm working on figuring out my chapters, what the main arguments in each chapter will be, but also working on this document, this proposal, which includes everything from the book overview to marketing strategy to, of course, the chapter outline, which is more detailed than this outline that I've got here. The proposal also contains sections such as the timeline, which is, of course, the major milestones for your book project. And so I could self-publish this, but I want to go through the effort of actually trying to get this traditionally published and doing it the right way. And I'm sure I'd like to find a publisher that's very nature-oriented, ecocentric perhaps, as close as possible to Ecocentric. I'm aware of some small presses, such as Florist Books in Edinburgh. Florist Books has published Patrick Curry's Enchantment, Wonder of Modern Life. However, I think that they have their own unique publication system, and I think they're more interested in books that are have some connection to the Rudolf Steiner. I think it's the Steiner-Waldorf system of education. Can't quite remember, but essentially they're looking for a more specific type of proposal in fiction, non-fiction book. But I do have some ideas of various presses that I could potentially submit my proposal to. With all that said, let's get into the book itself. Now, of course, this will be... It's all very subject to change. It's going to shift over the months and probably most likely years that I'll be writing this book. I just know that I want to write a book based on thresholds and portals, because of course I've always been interested in this motif, the symbol of the gate and the power of liminality and so forth, passageways and openings to other ways of seeing and being. And of course I wrote the essay The Gate for Reliquie back in 2022. And it features that the type of ideas that are in this book feature in various ways in my essays and stories and so forth. So because there's quite a lot to get into here, I am just going to read verbatim some of what I've written in this outline. This outline here, I sent to people at the Ecological Citizen just for some reassurance. Towards that place, thresholds, portals and ecocentric horizons. The main motif of this book is that of the threshold and portal, with which I've always been fascinated. This allows the book to narrow in on differences, contrasts, boundaries and limits. Furthermore, a focus on thresholds and portals ensures that the two main ways forward involve revealing and connecting. The guiding phrase itself hinting at movement through a portal will be towards that place, which carries multiple meanings depending on the context. In the broadest sense, it will contrast modern notions of progress with the desire to move towards a more ecocentric horizon. Modern notions of progress being masculinist endeavours, transhumanism, philosophies of death, sterility, everything that takes us out of the earth and ensures that we are not inhabiting the earth, we are trampling over it and are seeking to transcend it. Number 2. The book is structured as a journey outward from the city, beginning with urban issues and gradually shifting towards working in and thinking about nature. The book simultaneously moves from practical actions to more contemplative themes as well. That is the current structure of the book, which I do have some misgivings about, but that's where we are currently. Though the impetus, and this is a very broad point here, though the impetus for Towards That Place is the longing for another world, at the deepest level I will always contend that there can be no final transcendent movement to another plane. I therefore opt to speak of a better world instead. My argument is that we should engage with, dwell near and think about thresholds and portals to rediscover that this is the only world we have. And I say here, no ladders in this book a la Wittgenstein. No off-world journeying. I'm not interested in, although I do have this deep desire for another world, and I've talked about this in various videos over the years, this is the only world we have, so we have to better it. We have to better it, or come into a better relationship with it. Um, so that's the main point. Now, of course, again, this is all going to be subject to change, and I'm going to try and approach this in a way that doesn't give too much away, while still giving you enough detail about what I'm interested in and the type of ideas that will um, inform this book. Chapter 1, Unseen World. Now, each chapter contains has attached to it various imagery related to thresholds and portals. So I'm saying here that, to begin with, there's a distinct lack of openings in passageways. This chapter will argue that we are becoming blind to the world around us and that we rarely come into contact with the other side. That is, and I'm speaking very broadly and loosely, nature, different ways of seeing and being, the other, and so forth. It will primarily examine this disconnect through the modern urban conurbation, suggesting that large towns and cities block out, and here I'm using Han, Byung-Chul Han, which, by the way, I have a review out of Byung-Chul Han's Non-Things, Upheaval in the Life World, published very recently in the Ecological Citizen. So Han suggests that the pleading things of the world are being lost and blocked out. So let me read the sentence again. It will primarily examine this disconnect through the modern urban conurbation, suggesting that large towns and cities block out the pleading things of the world, hem us in, as well as disorientate us and other animals. So one of the main inspirations for this book is the, surprisingly enough, a very obscure and not very well known, but wonderfully enchanting short film called Every Star by Yawen Zheng. I've actually talked about this short film in my video Treasured Creations, I think it's called. It involves a young boy rather, looking out over a city, an ugly cityscape, and there's a figure who seemingly comes from another world, from the other side, and he makes contact with him in a very beautiful and moving fashion. So what I'm hoping to do with this first chapter is really, I want to cover all the issues with the urban environment, the inhuman scale of cities, globalization, rendering the regional differences completely inert, to further progress the circulation of communication and capital. I want to discuss anti-nature architectural styles, and this is a subject that I seem to be drawn more and more to over the years. Indeed, sometimes I think I should have done art history, because one of the things I'm most interested in is a physical, concrete expression of how we view the world through art and architecture. And I think part of that is because I grew up, again, playing World of Warcraft and being immersed in these different cultures, these different areas. Of course, the land of the Night Elf, the land of the Tauren and the Dwarf and the Blood Elf and so forth. These different cultures that have their own unique relationship to the land and have their own individual, particular and local architectural styles. And I think that's just always grabbed me. And indeed, I'm actually currently writing an article for the Ecological Citizen called "Imprisonment of the Mind." I think it's called, subtitle something like "Breaking the Disorientation," and breaking disorientation in the urban environment through earth-centered architecture, something like this. It's going to look at the abundance of sameness or uniformity in the urban environment, but also, on the other hand, chaos and disorder and ugliness, and how we need to abandon both extremes and look towards something more rooted in tradition, the small scale, the local in particular. Anyway, that's tangential. And also the profusion of advertisements, noise and light. So this chapter is really going to be looking at all of the issues with the urban environment. But everything is going to be based on looking outward, finding uh, finding openings towards other ways of seeing and being. And I've written here, this chapter provides a starting point for discussion since most people live in cities, and this is where many of the problems with modernity lie. It acts as a microcosm of the other chapters. Chapter 2, Wonderful Windows. The imagery for this chapter is frames, and more generally, the notion of art as a window onto the world was a very common and well-established idea. A chapter on personal and public experiences of art, including fine art, literature and games. Now this is obviously there's a lot to talk about there, so to narrow things down, this chapter will revolve around the idea of framing. At the highest level, this means looking at how we frame reality and will argue for creating positive visions of the world. And I say throughout the chapter I will weave the mediums together to show how framing in art shapes perception, then transition into how literature frames the world through storytelling, and finally how games create interactive frames that allow for different kinds of engagement with the world. There's a lot to go into there, of course, and I do worry about the chapter in some sense, although it's one I feel most confident about. So to begin with, art, I will talk about, for example, these are just examples, galleries as miniature other/better worlds into which we enter. The importance of frames versus installations in art. Now, of course, I could get into more detail here, but suffice it to say, I'm drawing on Patrick Curry's ideas of enchantment in art, the importance of frames and difference in the enchanting encounters with art. So the frame provides difference, whereas installations are diffuse. The section on art as well will challenge the modernist penchant for overt abstraction and ugliness as well. That's a major point. I want to try and show that we should return to beautiful visions of the world and art as guidance, and I don't know, a more positive outlook on the world through art. Not this idea that the world is somehow an ugly and arbitrary place, so we must create art in installations in public squares that assert that this is some immutable fact. This is it's a vicious cycle, really, and actually that's what I'm going to be talking about in one half of my TEC article. Still on the art section here, I would also like to critique forms of activism that disrupt the viewing experience and leave little room for inspiration and guidance. And here I'm really talking about recent forms of activism that I disagree with, which I've talked about before. I do not agree with that approach. Moving on to literature, and again there is a lot to discuss here. This will mainly cover the depreciation of certain forms of storytelling, conducive to enchantment and the power of narrative. Relatedly, and most specifically, the distrust of fantasy, which is it's not so much an issue today. However, it's still a problem. The modernist distrust of storytelling, the scorning of naivety, naivety being a positive quality. We need to cultivate a second naivety, as opposed to always being the adult in the room and fantasy storytelling. That's just for children. It's just make believe. And finally, and these are all subsections, of course: art, literature, and games. And the third one here is games. So I'm going to argue that some computer games have the potential to change our awareness of the world. So, again, I think you can perhaps see why I have some misgivings about this chapter. There's a lot to cover. But I would like to discuss, of course, role-playing games, World of Warcraft being one of them, but also just games that dwell on the idea of thresholds and portals. So Gorogoa would be a primary example. And of course I just reviewed Gorogoa. Unlike many books in this genre of green studies, I suppose, I will argue for games ultimately, even though I'm aware of the issues with nature deficit disorder and game addiction and so forth. So, the placement of this chapter, it follows naturally, I think, from the first, in that art, literature and games are direct means of solace and awakening that most of us have access to. More personally, these things help me awaken to the world. Chapter 3, and some of these chapters are a bit looser and more broad, and this is one of them. And indeed, I don't want the video to be too long, so I will try and speed things up a little bit. Chapter 3, Remembrance. The primary image for this chapter is Janus, the god Janus, who looks forward and back at the same time, the Roman god of entryways and doorways and so forth. Also related to the imagery for this chapter, museum entrances, ancient doorways, stone circles, church tympanims. This chapter will explore the value of museums and heritage sites as miniature other/better worlds into which we enter, connecting us to the story of the world, and that was a theme of the first chapter as well. More broadly, it will argue for the need to value tradition in a non-reactionary way, so that we can keep the past within us at the same time as looking to the future, while challenging anti-nature traditions and outlooks. Of course, I have a very broadly socially conservative outlook nowadays, well, as I grow older. I think most people do, of what keeping what works, and here I am using admittedly a lot of what Patrick says, the value of radical nostalgia, the local, the particular, the small scale. And here I would like to draw on people like Ruskin, Scruton, Oakeshott, people like this, people that are conservatism as a very broad outlook, not as one particular party, certainly not. But that's just a very broad scale of this chapter. Again, with each of these chapters, I'm drawing on my own experiences and interests, and this particular chapter, if you've not guessed already, is based on my love of museums and galleries. I'm really thinking here of the National Museum of Scotland, and I obviously talked about this and showed it in my long trip to Scotland video called In My Own Country. And that museum is really where I really discovered a love of prehistory in particular, and natural history as well. So as for the structure of this, the reason for the placement of Remembrance, chapter 3, the chapter is still largely set in the city because we're talking about museums, but it does start to move outwards with an examination of heritage sites. I'm not entirely sure if that makes sense just yet, but that's currently where I am. Apologies for the noise, but I'm not slowing down for a machine. The next chapter is Tree and Leaf. Now, I've not actually been giving the rationale for each chapter title. Some of you might be interested. Chapter 1, Unseen World, is a general title, but it's inspired by a Chelsea Wolfe song. Chapter 2, Wonderful Windows, is inspired by the dynamics of wonder or enchantment, but also it is, as I often bring up, related to Lord Dunsany's story, The Wonderful Window. Chapter 3, Remembrance, is inspired by a saying, remember the men from whom you are descended. I had that engraved on a leather satchel that I had commissioned in 2013, I think it was. Yes, remember the men from whom you are descended, valuing the past. And chapter 4, Tree and Leaf, is inspired by the guild in my role-playing experiences in Azeroth in World of Warcraft. I had a guild called Tree and Leaf Travel, which was a a company dedicated to exploring and botany and all manner of expeditions. Really, it was really enjoyable to run that guild and to explore and learn about the landscapes and the biomes and the species of Azeroth. So we're moving further out of the city here. We're on this walk. We're going towards that place. Now, towards that place again, it primarily means engaging with, dwelling near thresholds and portals, but it's also about solace and modernity as well. Tree and leaf. The portal and threshold imagery is that of field guides as gateways, woodland shelters perhaps, styles, nature reserve and country park entrances. This chapter is all about engaging in the natural world in various ways, learning about natural history, but also practicing perhaps bushcraft, wilderness skills, getting out of one's comfort zone as well and stepping through into country parks and here I'm drawing on my experiences as a teenager. A chapter on learning to be a student of nature. It will use field guides as an opening to discuss the importance of natural history and humility more broadly. Those two things are connected. The chapter will move from isolated experiences of learning in nature towards that of community engagement. So perhaps the reasons why we might engage in voluntary practices in nature, for country parks and for heritage sites. And we'll discuss more personal issues as well, such as, and here we'll discuss a topic that's really quite important to me, getting out of one's comfort zone when volunteering. So I remember being really taking quite a while to open up in my first voluntary experience, Yellow Craig, Triple SI, this beach that I featured in my Scotland video recently, in my own country. So this one is admittedly a bit broader, but there's a lot here that I could talk about regarding natural history and humility, the need to get outdoors and really experience. It's one thing talking about theory and so forth and engaging with art and literature and games, but you need to experience tree and leaf, the concrete world around us. As for the placement of tree and leaf, we're shifting further from the city to the outdoors, really forming a natural starting point, I say, for further discovery and practical involvement. I will be discussing some conservation issues in this chapter, and several reasons for learning about nature and working in the outdoors as well, but there's one particular area that I want to narrow in on in terms of working in the outdoors, but I'll come to that. Now this next chapter, Dark Domains, is one that it's less solidified currently. It draws upon my interest in othered species, more definitively othered species, the hidden and the small and the dark in nature. And here I'm really drawing on my experiences with carrion beetles, my dissertation on carrion beetles, my love of carrion beetles. And by the way, some of you might not know, I can't remember if I promoted this at the time, but I wrote an article about carrion beetles for Earth Tongues. So Dark Domains is the title itself. It's drawing on a short story collection by Grabinski, Dark Domains, which I have reviewed. Admittedly, this one isn't. This is more of a placeholder title currently. So the imagery for this chapter will be things like burrows and hives, fungal networks, hidden worlds essentially. So here you can see that I'm using portals and thresholds in a variety of different ways, openings, passageways, more metaphorical journeys and so forth. It's a range of different types of thresholds and portals. This chapter will take a closer look at how engaging with natural history in the outdoors can make us aware of definitively othered species. It will explore the darker side of what we unjustly fear or overlook due to anthropocentrism, and examine perceptual boundaries. So again, I'm interested in differences, limits, boundaries, and so forth. Topic examples might include biophobia, the fear and paranoia of nature, entomophobia, more specifically. The other is a form of resistance to the modern ideology of the cancer cell. Now this chapter could be placed nearer the end, where I talk about the power of darkness, but I think it does more neatly tie into the previous chapter on natural history. So chapter 6 is a big one, At the Edge. The title is inspired by various songs from Blind Guardian. So the various imagery related to thresholds and portals for this chapter: ecotones, forest edges, coastal and riparian zones, cols and mountain valleys, and so forth. This one is a bit trickier to explain, but I'll give it a go. It's a chapter in 2 parts, really. It will first look at issues of fragmentation, and this is really the main issue. I said that there was going to be one particular area that we need to look at in particular, and that is my interest in fragmentation. Fragmentation, as I write here, disrupts ecosystems and isolates habitats. But by connecting these spaces through corridors and passageways, we can transform edges from barriers into dynamic thresholds of interaction and renewal. So it's a chapter on fragmentation, essentially. But at the same time, I want to show that dwelling at liminal places and natural portal features invites us to contemplate our place within Earth's flows and relationships in a recursive way. Now that sounds quite broad and vague, doesn't it? I hope I can in some way integrate these 2 parts into the chapter. So what I'm thinking about in particular for the second part of this chapter is what I wrote about in an essay called Visions at the Window. And this wasn't published, unfortunately. I was really hoping it would be published, but it's about going out into nature and being aware of openings or windows or passageways in nature as a way of, almost as touchstones, almost as places to go to remember where you've come from and to remember what still needs to be done. It's rather difficult to describe in this setting, but indeed I still need to do a lot of work on these chapters, of course. But the chapter is going to be a more concrete exploration of issues relating to fragmentation, but then more personal and inward encounters with liminal places. So the placement for this chapter is that in the framing of the book, the chapter is placed further still out from the city as it's concerned with wider landscape scale issues. Chapter 7, Nightfall. This is one that I'm most interested in. The portal/threshold imagery for this chapter will be twilight leading into nightfall. Of course, twilight being and including nightfall as a threshold time, a liminal time. This chapter will examine the significance of twilight within the greater context of living in the twilight of the more than human world, particularly in regard to finding peace amid a flurry of noise and action. And this is a development of my essay Defiance in Half-Light that was published in Elsewhere journal not too long ago. I'm really going to be arguing that twilight is a time that allows us to engage with or to be aware of the more than human world. It's a time that when we sit looking at the twilight, this liminal enchanting time, we are aware of a time that is not for us, and yet at the same time we are still privy to its beauty. That's what I say in the essay. And then moving further into nightfall, into darkness. Of course, darkness is an interest of mine. The significance of darkness in its various forms. I wrote a short essay specifically for this channel called The Humble Dark. So this is going to be talking about darkness in more concrete terms, such as the abundance of light and noise, which does still relate to it was mentioned in the first chapter on the city. But it's also going to talk about darkness in more vague terms. So the importance of mystery, darkness as creativity rather than nullity, and also acceptance of limits to knowledge as well. So we need to value mystery, we need to value creativity and potentiality, and we need to value or understand that there are always going to be limits to how we go through the world and understand the world. So the placement for this chapter is that it complements the previous, in that at the edge was it concerned itself with spatial thresholds, whereas this chapter involves temporal thresholds. And the book further moves into the contemplative. I forgot to mention that the chapter titled Nightfall is inspired by various things such as the Night Elves, the album Nightfall in Middle-earth by Blind Guardian, and a variety of other inspirations as well. So the final chapter is chapter 8, Road of No Release. The road of no release is death. I will be arguing in this chapter that death is a threshold or portal that we must all cross, and that the denial of this journey is a major driver of ecocide. It will examine the ecological importance of death, cover the follies of transhumanism, and support the death acceptance movement, as well as advocate for practices such as natural burial. In terms of the placement for this chapter, it's really the end point of an ecological life. And it's also a contrast between the city and, I suppose, I want the chapter to be a physical movement outward from the city in contemplation of these different ideas. And it's interesting because the acceptance of death will contrast in the end the sterility of the city, in which death has no place culturally or historically. That'll be a major point in this last chapter. So I imagine that the book will end, I imagine it ending on a hill, looking out at the twilight, falling into nightfall, and then contemplating death. But also there's this idea that I have related to the end of the book, perhaps in the conclusion, that we've had this walk outwards, and again, towards that place means a variety of different things, but we've had this movement outwards from the city. But this book is it's not anti-civilizational. It's not suggesting that we must return to nature, which is really quite an impossible task nowadays, this romantic ideal. But it's about, I'm inspired by S.T. Coleridge's poem, Fears and Solitude, which I've mentioned before. It's one of my favourite poems, and it's important to me because there is this verse, with light and quickened footsteps, thitherward I tend, remembering thee, O green and silent dell. And so at the end of that poem, the speaker, who has been immersed in nature and in this glade, he finds solace, but then he comes back to the world of men, as we might say, as Tolkien might say. So it will always be about coming back. So we have engaged with portals in various ways, but in the greater framing of the book, we've gone towards that place, but we have to come back, inspired by nature, inspired by thresholds and portals. So really, I hope you can see that I've done a good amount of thinking about this, and it is the passion project. It's the thing that I most want to do, although that comes with a variety of anxieties. So I just want to end on, as it's getting rather cold and a bit dreary, I just want to end on some source examples. So I'll be drawing on things like, in the realm of beauty and art, Art and Enchantment by Curry, Beauty by Scruton, On Beauty and Being Just by Scarry, various texts from Ruskin. Darkness might include, for example, some insights from Darkness, A Cultural History by Edwards. On the subject of death, From Here to Eternity by Doty, Caitlin Doty. The Denial of Death by Becker. The Worm at the Core by Greenberg and Solomon. Enchantment and Wonder. Enchantment, Wonder, Modern Life by Curry, of course. Wonder and Other Essays by Hepburn. Non-Things in Capitalism. Capitalism and the Death Drive by Hahn. Non-Things, Upheaval in the Life World by Hahn. Malfeasance, Appropriation through Pollution by Ceres. I might, for example, draw on Heraclitus for Philosophy and Ethics, as well as the book How to Be Animal by Challenger. Portals and Thresholds, of course. A little book called Portals, Gates, Stiles, Windows, Bridges and Other Crossings by Lewis, which I've reviewed for this channel. The Virtual Window by Friedberg. Thinking on Thresholds, The Poetics of Transitive Spaces by Mukherjee. And finally, it's just a list of examples that I'm drawing from here. Tradition, Whatever Happened to Tradition by Stanley, and Wisdom of the Ancients by Oliver. Well, that was quite an endeavour to go through, and I have some misgivings about going into so much detail for the book, but I got carried away. Originally I started saying that I would just be a bit more vague, but I think that explication is needed to really get across what I'm trying to do with this book. So thanks for watching, everyone. Hopefully you found that interesting. Until next time.